Nebraska Territory, 1873. While every homesteader raced to install lightweight cast iron stoves before winter, one Russian Mennonite immigrant was still laying brick in late October. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Andreas Peters built a giant stone stove, 5 feet long, 6 feet high, weighing over 3 tons with 600 bricks. He positioned it in the center of his house, not against the wall like everyone else. He spent months on a heating system others finished installing in hours. Then the blizzards hit without warning. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Prairie winds cut across the settlement like knives. Standard cast iron stoves failed. Families burned furniture, fence rails, anything that would catch fire and still woke to frost on the inside walls. But that giant stone stove? Peters fired it just twice a day with grass and straw, and his house stayed warm enough that neighbors moved in when their own homes became uninhabitable. What did he understand about heat storage and fuel efficiency that everyone else missed? And how did his excessive preparation become the difference between survival and suffering for an entire settlement? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The treeless expanse of Nebraska Territory stretched endlessly under the October sky of 1873, broken only by scattered frame houses rising like wooden boxes from the prairie grass. In the settlement near what would become York County, the familiar rhythm of frontier construction filled the crisp air. Hammers driving nails into pine boards, the scrape of shovels cutting sod, and the creak of wagon wheels hauling supplies from the railroad depot 30 miles east. Each homesteader worked with the same urgency that had driven settlers across the plains for decades. Get walls up, get a roof on, and get a stove installed before the killing cold arrived. Most of the heating decisions had already been made at the hardware stores in Omaha or shipped directly from Chicago. Cast iron cook stoves weighing perhaps 200 pounds, with thin shells that could be wrestled into place by 2 men and connected to a simple stovepipe. Sheet iron box stoves even lighter, designed to throw quick heat when stuffed with wood, corn cobs, or the twisted prairie grass that homesteaders called hay. The storekeeper in the nearest town had assured every customer that these were proven solutions, tested in farmhouses from Ohio to Iowa, reliable as sunrise. Andreas Peters had listened to that same advice when he first arrived from the Molochna colony on the Black Sea, carrying little more than his family and memories of Russian winters that could freeze a man solid between his house and barn. But as he watched his neighbors sliding thin iron boxes into their frame houses, he thought of the massive brick stoves that had heated his childhood home in Ukraine, central furnaces built like small buildings, radiating warmth for 24 hours from a single hot fire. The American way looked efficient until you considered what happened when fuel ran short or temperatures dropped below what thin metal could handle. While other settlers completed their heating installations in a matter of hours, Peters began laying out something entirely different in the center of his modest farmhouse. He had ordered 600 bricks from a kiln near Lincoln, along with barrels of clay and sand for mortar. His neighbors, stopping by to borrow tools or share news, watched him mark dimensions on the wooden floor. 5 feet long, 6 feet high, 2.5 feet wide. The footprint alone would consume nearly 30 square feet of precious interior space, and the finished weight would push 3 tons, enough to stress the floor joists of any normal frame house. The construction progressed like nothing anyone in the settlement had seen. Peters built upward in carefully planned stages, starting with a deep ash pit lined with fire brick, then a combustion chamber sized for burning loose materials, straw, prairie grass, dried manure formed into blocks. Above that came a baking oven with its own door, positioned to capture heat from the firebox below. The real innovation began in the upper levels, where Peters created a maze of horizontal and vertical chambers connected by carefully sized passages. Hot gases from the fire would be forced through this labyrinth, transferring their energy into the surrounding brickwork before finally reaching the chimney. Edwin Carter, who farmed the adjoining quarter section, made no effort to hide his skepticism. He had grown up in Pennsylvania, where every farmhouse relied on wood-burning cook stoves that heated quickly and cost a fraction of what Peters was spending on brick and labor. "You'll pull that house off its foundation with that rock pile," Carter told anyone who would listen. "And what happens when you need to move it? You can't load 3 tons of brick into a wagon." Other neighbors nodded in agreement, pointing out that cast iron stoves could be purchased, installed, and burning the same day, while Peters had been building for weeks with no heat to show for it. The practical objections seemed sound until you understood what Peters was creating. Every brick in the structure served a purpose beyond simple containment. The thick walls would absorb and store heat during the short, intense firing periods, then release that energy slowly over 12 to 24 hours. The internal passages forced hot exhaust gases to travel a circuitous route, giving up their thermal energy to the masonry instead of sending it straight up the chimney like conventional stoves. The large thermal mass meant that firing the stove hard for an hour or two would charge the entire system, eliminating the need for constant feeding that kept families chained to their thin iron boxes. Peters had learned these principles during childhood winters in the Molochna colony, where central masonry stoves were as common as barns and just as essential. Russian peasant stoves, some called them, though the engineering was anything but crude. Village craftsmen had spent centuries refining the proportions: firebox size, passage dimensions, thermal mass calculations that would extract maximum heat from minimum fuel. When wood was scarce, families burned straw, dried grass, even prepared blocks of manure mixed with clay, firing hot and fast in the morning and evening while the stove radiated steady warmth throughout the day and night. The settlement's unofficial heating expert, a former railroad man who sold stoves and pipe, dismissed the entire project as old-world foolishness. "That's not how you heat a house in America," he declared, tapping his knuckles against the thin shell of a cast-iron cook stove. "This here will warm your kitchen in 5 minutes. That pile of brick will take all day just to get started." He spoke with the authority of someone who had sold dozens of stoves and never heard a complaint, at least not during mild weather when any heat source seemed adequate. By late October, Peters had completed his giant stone stove and connected it to a substantial chimney that rose through the center of his house. The finished structure dominated the main room like a massive piece of furniture, its whitewashed surfaces broken by iron doors for the firebox, ash pit, and baking oven. A broad ledge along one side provided a warm bench where family members could sit during the coldest weather, while the heat radiated outward through walls thick enough to walk on. The total cost in materials and labor had exceeded what 3 families might spend on conventional stoves, and the construction time had stretched well into the season when other homesteaders were already testing their heating systems. The neighbors who stopped to examine the completed work shook their heads at what appeared to be massive overbuilding for a simple heating problem. Carter calculated that Peters had used enough brick to build a small barn, all for the purpose of burning grass and straw that a $50 sheet iron stove could handle perfectly well. "You can't burn grass in a stove," became the common verdict around kitchen tables, though none of the critics had bothered to study how the internal chambers and passages might change the combustion dynamics. They knew what worked: thin metal, constant feeding, direct heat. And Peters's 3-ton alternative looked like the kind of mistake immigrants made before they learned American ways. Peters accepted the criticism without argument, partly because he understood their reasoning, and partly because winter would provide the only test that mattered. The stove was complete, the chimney drew properly, and his family had already begun the twice-daily routine that would carry them through the months ahead. Every morning and evening, they would load the large firebox with whatever combustible material the prairie provided, fire it hard and hot for an hour or so, then close the dampers and let the thermal mass do its work. The neighbors could keep their quick-heating iron boxes and their constant stoking schedule. Peters had built for endurance, not speed, trusting in principles that had kept families warm through Ukrainian winters, far harsher than anything Nebraska could offer. The first blizzard arrived on November 15th with the sudden violence that characterized plains weather, transforming a clear morning into a whiteout by noon. Wind-driven snow piled against the north walls of frame houses, while temperatures plummeted to 10 below zero and stayed there. What had seemed like adequate heating arrangements just days earlier now revealed their limitations as families huddled around cast-iron stoves that glowed red-hot when stuffed with fuel but turned cold within hours of the fire dying down. Edwin Carter found himself stoking his cook stove every 3 hours around the clock, burning through his modest pile of railroad ties and scrap lumber at an alarming rate. The thin metal shell radiated intense heat directly into the kitchen, but left the rest of his house barely above freezing. By the third day of continuous firing, he had burned half his winter fuel supply and still woke each morning to find ice crystals forming on the inside walls of his bedroom. His wife wrapped the children in every quilt they owned and moved their sleeping pallets closer to the kitchen, but the stove's heat dissipated so rapidly that stepping 10 feet away meant entering a zone of bone-deep cold. Across the settlement, other families faced identical struggles with identical stoves. The sheet iron box heaters proved even less effective than the cast iron cook stoves, their lightweight construction unable to retain heat once the fire burned down. Homesteaders found themselves in a cruel cycle, overfiring their stoves to combat the cold, which consumed precious fuel without providing lasting warmth, then scrambling to find anything combustible when their carefully hoarded supplies dwindled faster than expected. Fence rails, furniture legs, even precious books disappeared into the hungry iron boxes, generating momentary heat that vanished up the straight stove pipes within minutes of combustion. Meanwhile, Andreas Peters had settled into a routine that seemed almost leisurely by comparison. Each morning at dawn, he opened the firebox of his massive stone stove and loaded it with twisted prairie grass, dried corn stalks, and blocks of prepared manure mixed with straw. The fire burned with intense heat for approximately 90 minutes, creating a roaring blaze that consumed everything in the large combustion chamber. But instead of sending this thermal energy straight up the chimney like his neighbors' stoves, the internal maze of passages forced the hot gases through a serpentine path that extracted every usable degree of heat before allowing the exhaust to escape. The physics were straightforward once you understood the principle. Hot gases entering the first chamber above the firebox were forced horizontally through a narrow passage, transferring heat to the surrounding brickwork. From there, the cooled gases descended through a vertical channel, then rose again through another passage, then descended once more, creating a long thermal pathway that wrung maximum energy from the combustion process. By the time the exhaust reached the chimney, it had given up most of its heat to the 3 tons of brick and mortar that formed the stove's thermal battery. Peters would close the firebox door after his morning burn and go about his daily work while the massive stove quietly radiated stored heat throughout the house. The thick brick walls remained warm to the touch 18 hours later, maintaining interior temperatures that allowed his family to work in shirt sleeves while their neighbors shivered in multiple layers. During the most severe cold snaps, he would fire the stove again in the evening, but often a single morning burn provided sufficient heat to carry the household through an entire 24-hour period. The contrast became impossible to ignore as the blizzard stretched into its second week. Carter's fuel pile, which he had calculated would last through February, shrank to a few armloads of split fence rails and broken furniture. The cast iron stove demanded constant attention, banking coals at night, rekindling fires before dawn, feeding combustible material every few hours to maintain any semblance of warmth. His family took turns staying awake to tend the fire, knowing that letting it die completely would mean waking to a house cold enough to freeze water in the kitchen basin. Other homesteaders faced even worse conditions. The family in the house nearest the creek had run completely out of conventional fuel and resorted to burning twisted grass pulled from under the snow, material so poor that it required constant feeding to generate any heat at all. Their sheet iron stove, adequate during mild autumn weather, proved completely inadequate for sustained sub-zero temperatures. The children developed chilblains on their fingers and toes, while the adults spent their days gathering any combustible material they could find on the wind-scoured prairie. Thomas Meehan, the horticulturist who had traveled through the settlement earlier that autumn, would later write about witnessing the fuel crisis that winter. Families who had seemed comfortably established in October were burning their spare furniture and fence materials by December, victims of heating systems designed for milder climates and abundant wood supplies. The cast iron stoves that worked adequately in Pennsylvania farmhouses, where split oak and maple were available by the cord, revealed their shortcomings when fuel became scarce and temperatures remained consistently brutal. Peters's approach to the crisis demonstrated the wisdom embedded in old-world heating technology. Rather than burning continuously at low intensity like his neighbors, he fired his stove hard and fast, creating temperatures that approached 1800 degrees in the combustion chamber. This intense heat was then captured and stored in the massive brick structure, which released it slowly and steadily over the following hours. The system was essentially a thermal battery, charged twice daily and providing consistent warmth without the constant fuel consumption that was bankrupting his neighbors. The efficiency difference was measurable in concrete terms. Where Carter burned through a pile of wood scraps in 3 days, Peters used perhaps a tenth as much material, mostly prairie grass and prepared manure blocks, to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the same period. The secret lay in the combustion method and thermal mass. Complete combustion at high temperatures extracted maximum energy from poor quality fuel, while the heavy masonry structure prevented that energy from escaping up the chimney before it could heat the living space. By late November, with temperatures holding steady at 15 below zero and no break in the weather forecast, several families had burned through their entire winter fuel supplies. The hardware store's confident predictions about cast iron stove efficiency seemed like cruel jokes when confronted with the reality of Plains winter conditions. Thin metal shells that heated quickly also cooled quickly, creating a constant drain on fuel supplies that few homesteaders had anticipated when they chose speed and convenience over thermal mass and efficiency. The settlement faced a genuine crisis as December approached. Fuel shortages that had seemed manageable during brief cold snaps became life-threatening when combined with sustained sub-zero temperatures and limited supplies. Families began eyeing their wooden floors and interior walls as potential fuel sources, knowing that spring was still 4 months away and their carefully planned heating systems had failed the first serious test of a Nebraska winter. Only one household in the entire settlement seemed immune to the growing desperation, warmed by a giant stone stove that their neighbors had dismissed as wasteful foreign foolishness just weeks before. The crisis deepened on December 3rd when a second blizzard struck before the settlement had recovered from the first, bringing with it wind chills that froze exposed skin in minutes and temperatures that dropped to 25 below zero. Edwin Carter stood in his kitchen at 4 in the morning, feeding the last of his fence rails into a cast iron stove that had become his family's lifeline and their curse. The thin metal glowed cherry red within minutes of loading, filling the small room with scorching heat that drove everyone back against the walls. But 30 minutes later, the fire had consumed the wood, and the stove began its inevitable cooling cycle. Carter had discovered the fundamental flaw in thin-walled iron construction during those weeks of constant firing. Cast iron heated rapidly, but held almost no thermal mass. The moment combustion ceased, the metal began radiating its stored energy into the room and losing temperature at a rate that matched the ambient cold. By dawn, the stove that had been too hot to approach was cold enough to touch with bare hands, and the house temperature had dropped below freezing despite the family's desperate efforts to bank coals and maintain some semblance of fire. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Carter's cook stove, weighing perhaps 200 pounds, could store only as much heat as its metal mass would hold. Even when fired to dangerous temperatures, that thermal capacity lasted mere hours in sub-zero conditions. Meanwhile, his fuel consumption had increased to levels that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. What began as a modest pile of railroad ties and scrap lumber, carefully calculated to last through February, had dwindled to a few armloads of furniture legs and split door frames by the first week of December. Other families faced even more desperate circumstances. The Johnsons, whose sheet iron box stove weighed less than 50 pounds, had burned through everything combustible in their house except the floorboards and wall studs. Their heating system, adequate for the mild autumn weather when they installed it, proved completely inadequate for sustained extreme cold. The lightweight metal construction that made the stove easy to transport and install also made it useless for storing heat, creating a vicious cycle of constant firing that consumed fuel faster than they could gather it from the wind-stripped prairie. 3 houses down from Carter, the Schmidts had resorted to burning twisted prairie grass pulled from under the snow, feeding their stove every 15 minutes with material so poor it barely generated enough heat to warm the immediate area around the firebox. Their children huddled in beds piled with every piece of fabric they owned, while their parents took shifts through the night to maintain the minimal fire that stood between their family and freezing to death in their own home. The technical failure of cast iron heating became evident when measured against basic physics principles. Thin metal walls conducted heat rapidly in both directions, absorbing energy quickly from the fire, but losing it just as quickly to the surrounding air. The straight stovepipes that connected these heaters to their chimneys created an efficient pathway for hot gases to escape directly outdoors, carrying with them the majority of the thermal energy that should have been out heating the living space. Carter estimated that his stove sent 3/4 of its heat up the chimney, while the remaining quarter provided only temporary warming before dissipating into the poorly insulated frame house. Meanwhile, Andreas Peters maintained his twice-daily routine with what seemed like supernatural calm. Each morning and evening, he loaded his massive firebox with prairie grass, corn stalks, and prepared manure blocks, materials that his neighbors considered barely worth gathering. The fire burned with intense heat for roughly 90 minutes, creating temperatures that would have destroyed a cast iron stove, but were easily contained within the thick firebrick lining of his combustion chamber. The critical difference lay in what happened after combustion ceased. While his neighbors' stoves immediately began cooling once the fire died down, Peters's 3-ton brick structure continued absorbing heat from the internal maze of passages long after the flames disappeared. Hot gases that would have shot straight up a conventional stovepipe were forced through horizontal chambers, then down vertical passages, then up again through narrow channels, surrendering their thermal energy to the surrounding masonry at each turn. Peters had built what engineers would later recognize as a heat exchanger, a system designed to extract maximum energy from the combustion process before allowing exhaust gases to escape. The serpentine path through his stove's internal chambers increased the surface area contact between hot gases and brick walls, ensuring that thermal energy was transferred to the structure rather than lost through the chimney. By the time exhaust reached the outside air, it had cooled to temperatures barely above ambient, indicating that the system had captured nearly all available heat for storage in the masonry mass. The stored heat released slowly and steadily over the following 12 to 24 hours, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures without any additional fuel input. Peters could place his hand on the stove's brick walls 18 hours after firing and feel warmth that would continue radiating for several more hours. The thick masonry acted as a thermal battery, charged during the brief firing periods and discharged gradually throughout the day and night. Carter began timing the temperature cycles in both houses during the second week of December, using a thermometer borrowed from the settlement's makeshift school. His kitchen reached 90 degrees within 30 minutes of loading his cast iron stove, then dropped to 40 degrees by dawn, a 50-degree swing that left his family alternately sweltering and shivering throughout each 24-hour period. Peters's house maintained a steady 70-degree temperature with variations of less than 10 degrees, creating living conditions that seemed impossible given the brutal weather outside. The fuel consumption differences were even more dramatic. Carter calculated that he was burning wood equivalent to what Peters used in 5 days, yet achieving inferior results in terms of comfort and temperature stability. His constant stoking schedule had become a form of slavery, requiring someone to tend the fire every few hours or face the consequences of a house that became uninhabitably cold within a few hours of the fire dying down. By mid-December, with fuel supplies exhausted and temperatures showing no signs of moderating, Carter faced a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. His family could freeze in their own home, maintaining the pretense that American heating methods were superior to foreign innovations, or they could swallow their pride and seek shelter in the house they had mocked as an example of old-world foolishness. The giant stone stove that had seemed like wasteful overbuilding in October now represented the difference between survival and catastrophe for a settlement that had trusted conventional wisdom over proven engineering. The knock came at Peters's door just after midnight on December 18th, tentative at first, then more urgent as the wind howled across the prairie with a ferocity that threatened to strip the roof from any structure not built to withstand it. Edwin Carter stood on the threshold with his wife and 3 children, their faces pale with exhaustion and cold, carrying bundles of clothing and blankets that represented everything they could salvage from their freezing house. The cast iron stove that had seemed so reliable in October had finally consumed the last piece of burnable material they possessed, leaving them with a choice between seeking help or facing temperatures that would kill them before dawn. Peters opened his door without surprise, having watched smoke disappear from neighboring chimneys throughout the week as families ran out of fuel or their heating systems finally failed under the relentless strain of sub-zero weather. His own house remained comfortably warm despite the Arctic conditions outside, the massive stone stove radiating steady heat from its morning firing 8 hours earlier. The thick brick walls were still warm to the touch and would continue providing heat through the night and well into the following day. Carter entered the house with the awkward dignity of a man whose pride had been thoroughly broken by circumstances beyond his control. He had spent weeks dismissing the giant stone stove as foreign foolishness, confident that American ingenuity and cast iron efficiency would prove superior when tested by real frontier conditions. Now his family huddled gratefully around the masonry structure that had become their salvation, feeling warmth that penetrated their bones for the first time in days. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone present. Where Carter's house had swung between scorching heat near the stove and freezing cold everywhere else, Peters's home maintained an even temperature throughout every room. The children, who had been sleeping in their parents' bed surrounded by every quilt the family owned, spread out across the floor near the warm brick benches that flanked the stove's base. For the first time in weeks, they removed their heavy coats and boots, able to move freely without the constant threat of frostbite. Within 48 hours, 2 more families had arrived at Peter's door with similar stories of heating failure and depleted fuel supplies. The Johnsons brought their 3 young children after their sheet iron box stove cracked under the stress of constant overfiring, creating a gap that made the unit useless for heating. The Schmidts arrived after burning everything combustible in their house, except the structural timbers, having discovered that twisted prairie grass alone could not sustain temperatures necessary for survival when the thermometer dropped below 20 degrees. Peters accommodated each family without complaint, though his house was now sheltering 15 people in a space designed for 5. The massive stone stove proved equal to the increased demand, requiring only slightly more fuel to maintain comfortable temperatures for the expanded household. The key was the system's fundamental efficiency, rather than heating air that immediately escaped through cracks and poor insulation. The thermal mass captured and stored energy that was released gradually over extended periods. The fuel economics became a revelation to the refugees crowding into Peters's main room. Each family brought whatever combustible materials they had managed to gather: armloads of twisted grass, broken furniture, split fence posts, but discovered that the stone stove required far less material than their cast iron units had consumed. Where Carter's cook stove had demanded constant feeding to maintain any heat at all, Peters's system operated on 2 intensive burns per day, using perhaps 1/5 the fuel that conventional stoves would have consumed for the same heating effect. The technical superiority was measurable in concrete terms that even the skeptics could understand. Carter timed the firing cycles during his first week in the house, noting that 20 minutes of intense combustion in the large firebox generated 12 hours of steady heat throughout the entire structure. The internal maze of chambers and passages extracted thermal energy that would have escaped directly up a conventional chimney, storing it in 3 tons of brick and mortar that released warmth gradually throughout the day and night. More importantly, the stone stove burned poor quality fuel effectively, converting prairie grass and prepared manure into useful heat through complete combustion at high temperatures. The large firebox accommodated loose materials that would have clogged smaller iron stoves, while the intense heat created by the concentrated burn eliminated the incomplete combustion that wasted fuel and created excessive smoke. Peters could maintain comfortable temperatures using materials that his neighbors had dismissed as barely worth gathering. The social dynamics of the crowded household revealed additional advantages of the masonry heating system. Families could spread throughout the house without clustering around a single heat source, eliminating the competition for warm spots that had characterized life around cast iron stoves. Children played on the warm brick benches that flanked the main structure, while adults worked at tables placed anywhere in the main room, all enjoying consistent temperatures that made normal activities possible. Thomas Meehan, the horticulturalist who would later document these events for Eastern readers, estimated that Peters was heating a house containing 3 times its normal occupancy using less fuel than any single family had consumed with their individual cast iron stoves. The efficiency came from the fundamental design principles that Peters had brought from his Ukrainian childhood: thermal mass storage, complete combustion, and heat extraction through extended gas passages. The heating schedule became a community ritual during those crowded weeks. Each morning and evening, multiple families contributed materials for the communal fires: twisted grass gathered from the lee sides of buildings, corn stalks saved from autumn harvest, prepared blocks of dried manure mixed with straw and clay. The large firebox accommodated contributions from everyone, burning everything together in the intense, clean combustion that characterized properly operated masonry heaters. Peters taught his house guests the principles behind the system during the long winter evenings, explaining how the internal chambers forced hot gases through a serpentine path that extracted maximum energy before allowing exhaust to escape. The concept was simple enough for farmers to grasp immediately. The longer the path between fire and chimney, the more heat could be captured and stored in the surrounding masonry. Where conventional stoves created a direct pipeline from combustion to outside air, the stone stove functioned as a thermal maze that trapped energy for gradual release. By January, the community sheltering in Peters's house had become a working demonstration of old-world heating technology adapted to frontier conditions. 15 people lived comfortably in space that would have been barely adequate for 5 using conventional heating methods, sustained by a fuel consumption that was a fraction of what the same families had burned individually with their failed cast iron systems. The giant stone stove that had seemed like wasteful overbuilding in October had become the difference between survival and catastrophe for an entire settlement that had trusted American efficiency over proven traditional methods. Spring arrived late in 1874, with the last snow melting in April and families finally able to return to their own houses after months of communal survival around Peters's stone stove. The settlement that emerged from winter looked different than it had the previous autumn, marked not just by the physical damage of desperate fuel burning, but by a fundamental shift in understanding about heating and survival on the treeless plains. Houses that had seemed adequately prepared in October now showed the scars of crisis, missing fence rails, burned furniture, and interior walls stripped of wooden trim that had been fed to failing cast iron stoves during the worst cold snaps. Edwin Carter was among the first to approach Peters about copying the masonry heater design, bringing with him detailed measurements he had taken during the winter months when his family sheltered in the heated house. Carter had spent those long evenings studying the stone stove's construction, tracing the path of internal chambers with his finger and asking Peters to explain the principles that made the system so much more efficient than conventional iron heating. The humility was complete. The man who had dismissed the giant stove as wasteful foreign foolishness now requested help building an identical system in his own home. Peters shared his knowledge without reservation, walking Carter through the 6-level construction that began with the ash pit and firebox, progressed through the baking oven, then created the maze of horizontal and vertical chambers that captured heat from exhaust gases. The dimensions were critical: firebox sizing that accommodated loose prairie materials, passage widths that maintained proper draw while maximizing heat transfer, and thermal mass calculations that balanced storage capacity against construction cost. Each detail reflected centuries of refinement in Russian and Ukrainian villages where similar conditions had demanded maximum efficiency for minimal fuel. Within weeks, 3 more families had begun laying brick for their own versions of the grass-burning stove, using Peters's house as a template, but adapting the design to their specific needs and available materials. The Johnsons built a slightly smaller version, roughly 4 feet long instead of 5, but maintained the essential features of central placement, thermal mass, and serpentine gas passages. The Schmidts incorporated additional baking capacity into their design, expanding the oven section to accommodate the bread making that had been impossible during the winter when their failed heating system consumed all available fuel. The construction process became a community effort as neighbors shared labor and expertise in laying the complex internal chambers that distinguished masonry heaters from simple fireplaces. Peters taught the critical skill of creating proper passages, wide enough to maintain good draft but narrow enough to force intimate contact between hot gases and brick surfaces. The mortar work required precision, with joints that would withstand repeated heating and cooling cycles without cracking, and chamber walls thick enough to store substantial thermal energy. Thomas Meehan, the horticulturalist who had witnessed the previous autumn's construction, returned to the settlement in May and found a transformation that validated everything he had observed about the Russian heating system. The same families who had burned through entire winter fuel supplies with their cast iron stoves were now planning much smaller fuel requirements based on their experience with the stone stove's efficiency. Meehan interviewed Peters extensively about the technical details, recording the dimensions, brick counts, and firing schedules that made the system work. Meehan's documentation would prove crucial for spreading knowledge of the masonry heater beyond the immediate settlement. His article in the Gardener's Monthly provided exact specifications: the 5-foot length, 6-foot height, and 2.5-foot width, along with the estimated 600 bricks and clay mortar required for construction. More importantly, he explained the operational principles that distinguish the grass burner from conventional stoves, emphasizing the 20-minute firing schedule that heated a 48 by 27-foot house for an entire day. The fuel calculations impressed readers throughout the agricultural regions where wood was scarce and heating costs consumed significant portions of family budgets. Meehan documented that Peters' system used approximately 1/5 the fuel required by cast iron stoves for equivalent heating, achieving this efficiency through complete combustion and thermal storage rather than the constant low-level burning that characterized conventional heating methods. The implications were obvious to any farmer calculating winter expenses. A properly built masonry heater could reduce fuel costs dramatically while providing superior comfort. Other Mennonite settlements across Nebraska and Kansas began receiving inquiries about the grass-burning stoves, with delegations traveling from distant counties to observe working examples and learn construction techniques. The success of Peters' design had created a network of knowledge transfer that spread the traditional heating methods throughout the Plains region, where fuel scarcity made efficiency crucial for survival. Each new installation became a teaching tool, demonstrating the principles to neighbors who had previously trusted conventional wisdom about cast iron heating. The railroad town's hardware merchant, who had confidently sold cast iron stoves to nearly every homesteader the previous year, found himself ordering fire brick and specialized mortar as demand shifted toward masonry heating systems. His initial skepticism gave way to practical acceptance as customers reported dramatic reductions in fuel consumption and heating costs. The thin iron shells that had seemed like modern efficiency were revealed as wasteful technology when compared to the thermal storage capacity of properly built stone stoves. Peters himself became an informal consultant throughout the region, traveling to new settlements to teach construction techniques and troubleshoot installation problems. His knowledge represented a bridge between old-world craftsmanship and frontier necessity, translating centuries of Russian and Ukrainian heating experience into practical solutions for American conditions. The mockery that had greeted his original construction had been replaced by recognition that traditional methods often embodied engineering principles that modern shortcuts had abandoned. By autumn of 1874, over a dozen masonry heaters were operating in the settlement and surrounding area, each one a testament to the superiority of thermal mass heating over thin-walled iron construction. The approaching winter held no terror for families who had experienced the efficiency and reliability of the grass-burning stoves during the previous year's crisis. Fuel gathering became a manageable task rather than desperate scrambling, as homesteaders calculated their needs based on proven consumption rates rather than the wasteful appetite of cast iron heating. The transformation was complete when the local newspaper published an article praising the Russian furnaces that had saved the settlement during the hard winter, describing them as examples of practical engineering that American stove manufacturers would do well to study. The giant stone stove that had been dismissed as foreign foolishness had become the standard against which all other heating systems were measured, proving that traditional knowledge often contained solutions to problems that modern technology had failed to solve effectively. Peters's vindication extended beyond personal satisfaction to the validation of centuries-old heating principles that had sustained families through harsh climates long before cast iron was available. His willingness to build according to proven methods rather than convenient shortcuts had created a heating system that would influence frontier architecture throughout the plains, establishing masonry thermal storage as the preferred solution wherever fuel was scarce and winters were severe,